graves had been looted in antiquity. They found gold tiaras, gold and lapis jewelry, gold and electrum daggers, even a gold helmet, which was probably ceremonial, since gold helmets aren't very good at stopping a sword or an axe in battle. There were also delicate sculptures, such as the para figures that depict a goat in a tree. One of these lovely sculptures is now in the British Museum, the other is housed at the University Museum of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. The excavators at UR also unearthed the remains of a wooden harp with ivory and lapis inlays, which Woolley later had reconstructed. One of the royal tombs also contained a wooden box with inlays on front and back that Woolley dubbed the Standard of UR, thinking that Mysteries in Mesopotamia 55. Perhaps it had been carried on top of a pole into battle in front of the troops, much like the Romans had their banners centuries later. He suggested this because of the scenes that are depicted, which include a possible battle followed by loot presented to the king and then a victory banquet. Among the figures in the banquet scene is a musician holding a harp, which is partially the basis for Woolley's reconstruction. Of course, these scenes could also depict something else entirely, and this might be just a simple wooden box rather than a standard. The discussions and debates about the interpretation of this and some of the other objects still continue today, almost a century after Woolley and Malawan found the royal graves. PPPP. Woolley and Malawan were not the first archaeologists to find amazing things in the ancient sites of Mesopotamia. By the mid-1800s, serious excavations were underway at a number of ancient sites in the Middle East, underwritten by institutions like the British Museum and the Louvre, and conducted by people like Austin Henry Layard and Paul-Émile Botta. They excavated in what is now Iraq at places like Nineveh and Nimrud, capitals of the Assyrian Empire of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. They shipped magnificent pieces back to the museums, such as the colossal winged bulls, lion friezes, and other pieces currently on display at the British Museum and the Louvre. German and U.S. museums got into the act as well, sponsoring expeditions to the region and excavating at other sites such as Babylon, Uruk, and Nippur. Aiding the archaeologists were also epigraphers, scholars who study ancient writing, like the British scholar Henry Rawlinson, who helped to decipher cuneiform in the 1830s. Cuneiform is a wedge-shaped writing system. In fact, the very word cuneiform means wedge-shaped. It was used to write Akkadian, Babylonian, Hittite, Old Persian, and other languages in the ancient Middle East, much as we now use the Latin alphabet to write English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and so on. Rawlinson, who was a British army officer posted to what is now Iran, cracked the secret of cuneiform the same way that Champollion. 56 Chapter 4. Deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics, by translating a trilingual inscription. In Rawlinson's case, the inscription was written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. It had been carved by the imperial order of Darius the Great of Persia in about 519 BCE, 400 feet above the desert floor into a cliff face at the site of Behistun in Iran. The story that is often repeated is one originally told by Rawlinson himself. It seems that after spending as many as 12 years, from 1835 to 1847, copying the inscription by climbing up and down rickety ladders and scaffolding, he eventually hired a wild Kurdish boy to shimmy down a rope from the top of the cliff in order to copy the final lines of the long inscription. The boy had to swing from side to side and run along the vertical cliff face before somehow clinging to it in order to copy the last little bits. By 1837, just 2 years into the project, Rawlinson had already figured out how to read the first 2 paragraphs of the part that was written in Old Persian. He presented his findings in official papers published in 1837 and 1839, just ahead of others, including an elderly Irish parson named Hincks, who had also been working on deciphering the inscription. It reportedly took Rawlinson another 20 years to decipher the Babylonian and Elamite parts of the inscription and successfully read the whole thing. PPPP. Meanwhile, in December 1842, Paul-Émile Botta began the first archaeological excavations ever conducted in what is now Iraq. Although Italian-born, in his day job he was the French consul at Mosul, which was a position that essentially left him free to conduct archaeological fieldwork on behalf of the Louvre in Paris. That's what he spent most of his time doing, with the active endorsement of his higher-ups back in France. Botta's first efforts were concentrated on the mounds collectively known as Kuyunjik, which are right across the river from the city of Mosul. He didn't find much there and quickly abandoned his efforts, prematurely as it turned out. From one of his workers, he learned that Mysteries in Mesopotamia 57. Some sculptures had been found at a site called Khorsabad, located about 14 miles to the north. So, in March 1843, he began excavating there instead, with immediate success. Within a week he began to unearth a great Assyrian palace. At first he thought that he had found the remains of ancient Nineveh, but now we know that Khorsabad is the ancient site of Dur-Sharrukin, capital city of Sargon II, the Assyrian king who ruled from 721 to 705 BCE. As for Austin Henry Layard, he did not mean to undertake excavations in Mesopotamia, at least not at first. In 1839, at the age of 22, he had been traveling with a friend to Ceylon, overland from England. They had gone through Turkey and had visited Jerusalem, Petra, Aleppo, and other ancient cities, when they reached Mosul in May 1840. There the archaeology bug bit him, and he became interested in digging the ancient mounds across the river from Mosul, but it was a few years before he was able to return and begin to excavate. Layard's initial archaeological efforts, beginning in 1845, were at the site of Nimrud, which he first thought was ancient Nineveh. It was located a few miles downstream from Mosul. In order to fool the local ruler, a one-eyed, one-eared despot named Muhammad Pasha, Layard pretended to be going on a hunting expedition, but secretly included some excavating equipment in among his supplies. When he got to the site, he spent the first night in the hut of a local village chief, dreaming of what he might find. He described it later as visions of palaces underground, of gigantic monsters, of sculptured figures, and endless inscriptions. That turned out to be more of a premonition than a dream, for he found all that and more in the coming years. The next morning he began to dig. His team consisted of 6 local workers, whom he split into 2 teams. They began digging in 2 areas, far apart on the mound. Before the first day ended, both groups had uncovered rooms with walls covered in carved inscriptions. But the rooms belonged to 2 separate palaces. In a single day, Layard had found not 1, but 2 Assyrian palaces. Today they are usually called the Northwest and Southwest Palaces. As a result, he doubled the size of his team, to 11 workers. Later he expanded again, to a total of 30 workers. 58 Chapter 4. From the inscriptions that Layard found, it eventually became clear that a ruler named Asurnasirpal II had built the Northwest Palace. 200 years later, another ruler, named Esarhaddon, built the Southwest Palace. There also is a central palace at the site, which was discovered only later, built by Tiglath-Pileser III. Shalmaneser III, the son of Asurnasirpal II, also ordered buildings and monuments constructed at the site. In all, these rulers constructed their buildings over a period of more than 200 years, from 884 to 669 BCE. Other archaeologists have excavated at Nimrud since Layard, almost up until the present day. It was in the news as recently as March 2015, when videos were released by ISIS militants, showing them taking a bulldozer and a sledgehammer to the ancient remains at the site and also destroying artifacts from Nimrud in the Mosul Museum. Layard published a book about his amazing discoveries at Nimrud, among which was the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which is a pillar more than 6 feet tall covered with inscriptions detailing the king's exploits, which includes mention of the biblical Jehu, king of Israel. The book appeared in 1849 and instantly cemented his reputation as an archaeologist, intrepid adventurer, and engaging writer. He called the book Nineveh and its Remains, since that's what he thought he was excavating. This was an unfortunate choice for the title, for when Rawlinson deciphered the inscriptions from the site, it became clear that the ancient city was actually Kalhu, biblical Kala, rather than Nineveh. Kalhu was the second capital city established by the Assyrians, the first being Assur itself. Kalhu served as their capital for almost 175 years, from 879 BCE until 706 BCE. After that, Sargon II moved the capital to Dur-Sharrukin for a brief period, and then Sennacherib moved it to Nineveh. But where was Nineveh? Nobody had yet found it. PPPP. In 1849 Layard returned to Mosul for another round of excavations, which lasted until 1851. This time his primary focus was Kuyunjik, the mound that Bata had abandoned 7 years earlier. He now had enough money to hire up to 300 workers at a time, 10 times as many as at Nimrud. Mysteries in Mesopotamia 59. Layard had better luck than Bada. His men immediately began unearthing walls with reliefs and images from what turned out to be a palace built by Sennacherib, who ruled from 704 to 681 BCE. At first, Layard knew it only as the southwestern palace. Within it, he found what is referred to now as the King's Library. These were 2 large rooms in which clay tablets were piled a foot deep on the floor. When the translation of them began, the real name of the palace became clear: the Palace Without Rival. And this time, finally, Rawlinson's translation of the tablets found there confirmed that this was the actual site of ancient Nineveh, for Sennacherib had moved the Assyrian capital from Dur-Sharrukin to Nineveh after he came to the throne. Today, Sennacherib's palace is probably most famous for what is called the Lachish Room. Here Layard found wall reliefs, with both pictures and inscriptions carved into the stone slabs, showing Sennacherib's capture of the city of Lachish in 701 BCE. At that time, Lachish was the second most powerful city in Judah. Sennacherib attacked it before proceeding on to besiege Jerusalem. The capture of Lachish is described in the Hebrew Bible, as is the siege of Jerusalem. Layard's discovery was one of the first times that an event from the Bible could be confirmed by what we call extra-biblical, or outside the Bible, sources. Almost 30 years before Layard found Sennacherib's palace, Lord Byron immortalized the biblical account in his poem The Destruction of Sennacherib, published in 1815. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold. And the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, when the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee. Subsequent excavations at the actual site of Lachish, in what is now Israel, in the 1930s and again in the 1970s and 1980s, confirmed the destruction of the city in about 701 BCE. They also revealed an Assyrian siege ramp, built of tons of earth and rocks, which looks very similar to ramps depicted in Sennacherib's reliefs. The Nineveh reliefs also are full of gruesome scenes, including captives having their tongues pulled out and being flayed alive, along with decapitated heads placed on a pole. It is universally accepted that the Assyrians practiced what they preached and committed such atrocities, but the depiction of them in Sennacherib's palace is most likely meant. 60 Chapter 4. As propaganda, a means to deter other kingdoms from rebelling against the Assyrians. Foreign ambassadors were probably shown this room in the heart of the palace and then allowed to take the message back home that they shouldn't try to rebel or cross the Assyrians in any way, shape, or form. PPPP. On the excavation of Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh, Layard noted, in the magnificent edifice I had opened no less than 71 halls, chambers, and passages, whose walls had almost without exception been paneled with sculptured slabs of alabaster. He estimated that his workers had dug enough tunnels to expose almost 10,000 feet, or about 2 miles, worth of such walls, along with 27 doorways formed by colossal winged bulls and lion sphinxes. We should note, though, that Layard was a diplomat, not a trained archaeologist, nor was Bada, for that matter. Brian Fagan has said bluntly, Bada and Layard were appalling excavators by today's standards. In particular, Layard excavated by chasing walls, which we don't do in archaeology today. His men dug a trench straight down into the mound until they hit a stone wall, and then they followed the wall by digging a tunnel. When that wall met another, they turned the corner and tunneled along that wall, and so on until they had burrowed along all 4 edges of the room. Bada and his men did essentially the same thing. By excavating in this manner, Layard uncovered many of the inscribed slabs that made up these walls, as well as the colossal statues. But it also meant that he frequently left the middle of the rooms unexcavated. He also wasn't particularly interested in any of the pottery that his men uncovered during the course of their excavations. Many of the slabs were shipped back to the British Museum, where they can be seen on display today. Others, found both here and at Nimrud and Khorsabad, wound up in museum collections around the world, including some at Dartmouth and Amherst colleges in the United States. PPPP. It took a tremendous amount of effort to get the pieces back to the British Museum, or the Louvre in the case of Bada and his successor Victor. Mysteries in Mesopotamia 61. Place. Bada's finds went on display in the Louvre in May 1847, beating Layard and the British Museum by a matter of months, since their pieces didn't go on display until September of that year. In order to get his finds back to France, at one point Botta had a wagon built, with wheels that were 3 feet wide, only to find that it was too heavy to be moved, even by more than 200 workers. Layard had similar problems in transporting his finds back to England. Victor Place, who replaced Botta at Khorsabad, had the worst misfortune of all. It was on his watch that a major shipment, between 200 and 300 crates filled with antiquities, was lost in the Tigris River, while being sent to France in May 1855. Bandits intercepted the convoy as it floated down the Tigris after a stop at Baghdad. When they realized that the cargo wasn't gold, they spitefully capsized. Man-headed winged bull, Der Sharakan. 62 Chapter 4. The vessels and killed several of the crewmen. The crates of precious and irreplaceable ancient finds quickly sank straight to the bottom of the river. Nearly 120 contained antiquities from Khorsabad and another 68 contained sculptures from Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh, which place had been allowed to take for the Louvre, even though the British team had excavated them. There also was material from elsewhere in Mesopotamia, which had been retrieved by a French expedition to Babylonia. Only 78 of the crates were eventually recovered, leading Seton Lloyd, one of the greatest British archaeologists of recent times, to call this one of the most appalling disasters in the history of archaeology. The remainder has never been found. Dredging the river in this location using modern remote sensing technology might still be very worthwhile. PPPP. The finds kept coming. 2 years before the disaster on the Tigris, in 1853, Hormuzd Rassam, a native archaeologist and Layard's protege and successor at Nineveh, discovered Assurbanipal's palace at the site, right under the nose of Victor Place, who also was digging there. Assurbanipal was Sennacherib's grandson, ruling from 668 to 627 BCE. Rassam and his workers dug secretly for 3 straight nights in disputed territory on the mound, and when their trenches first revealed the walls and sculptures of the palace, Place could only congratulate them on their finds. Within the palace, it was Rassam's turn to find a tremendous library of cuneiform texts, just as Layard had done previously in Sennacherib's palace. It is generally considered that the state archives of Assyria, 25,000 tablets in all, were split between the 2 palaces. Even though they were 2 generations apart, they are now all in the British Museum. The texts found by Rassam in Assurbanipal's palace came from what is often called the Royal Library. Apart from the state documents, which provided a comprehensive portrait of the politics, economy, and social conditions of the Assyrian Empire, they include religious, scientific, and literary texts that Assurbanipal had instructed his scribes to collect or copy from all over the empire. They formed one of the great libraries of Mysteries in Mesopotamia. 63. The ancient world, perhaps to be mentioned in the same breath with the much later libraries at Pergamon and Alexandria. Among the tablets were copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Babylonian flood story. The flood story was first translated by George Smith, a banknote engraver in London who also moonlighted as an amateur Assyriologist at the British Museum. It was in 1872, nearly 20 years after Rassam first found the tablets, that Smith began piecing together a large fragmentary tablet. He was astonished to realize that it was an account of a great flood, very similar to the deluge account in the Hebrew Bible, the one that Noah had survived. In the account that Smith now held, which turned out to be the 11th tablet from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor was not Noah, but a man named Utnapishtim. When he announced his discovery at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Archaeology in December 1872, all of London was abuzz with excitement. The problem, though, was that a big piece was missing from the middle of the tablet, right at the part where everything gets interesting. And so, the Daily Telegraph, one of the newspapers of the day, promised £1,000 to anyone who would go look for the missing fragment. Smith himself decided to take them up on the offer, even though he had never been to Mesopotamia and had no training as an archaeologist. Within a week after he arrived at Nineveh, he found the missing piece. How on earth could he have done that? It turns out that it was very simple. He reasoned that perhaps the workers who had found the other fragments had missed this big one. So, rather than digging into the mound again, he searched through the back dirt pile, as it is called by archaeologists, that is, the huge artificial mound created by archaeologists and their workers when they dump out the earth while excavating a site. The dirt in these piles should be devoid of ancient objects, but the pile at Nineveh was full of them, because the workers had dug so fast and were frequently careless in picking out the pieces that they came across, whether they were pottery or clay tablets. Not only did Smith find the missing piece that he had come for, but he found something like 300 other pieces from clay tablets that the workers had also missed and thrown out. When he got back to London, the missing piece fit perfectly into his flood tablet. 64 Chapter 4. But this was only one of many accounts of a flood. Most recently, an Assyriologist at the British Museum, Irving Finkel, announced in 2014 that he had found another example of a different version of the flood story. In this version, the survivor is a man named Atrahasis. What is interesting about Finkel's tablet is it appears to describe the ark as being round in shape, as opposed to the way that we usually think of it. The tablet is in a private collection. The owner first brought it to Finkel in 1985 but wouldn't leave it with him long enough for him to translate it. It was only in 2009 that Finkel was able to gain access again and began translating it. PPPP. The 19th century excavations at Nimrud, Nineveh, and Khorsabad, and then at Ur, Babylon, Nippur, Uruk, and other sites, began an era of excavation in the region that continues to this day. The archaeology and textual work done in Mesopotamia has shed light on the origins of Western complex culture and the way such early beginnings largely shaped how our societies function today, from politics and laws to mathematics, medicine, education, taxes, and everything in between. Looking back now at these early archaeologists, some scholars have discussed whether they should be considered as having been part and parcel of European colonialism at the time and therefore disparaged as part of a European effort to co-opt the history of nations other than their own. Or if they were simply part of a competition or contest sponsored and underwritten by museums for their own gain. Even if those were the underlying motivations, however, the end result is that investigators like Layard, Botta, and others helped bring to light previously unknown, or unexcavated, civilizations such as the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Sumerians and contributed to enlarging our understanding of the origins of Western civilization. The additional question of whether such objects should now be returned to their countries of origin, which is a legitimate one, must also take into consideration the turmoil that has racked the Middle East since at least the early 1990s and which continues today, from Iraq to Syria. As recently as 1988, spectacular discoveries were made at Nimrud by local Iraqi archaeologists. There they uncovered the graves of several mysteries in Mesopotamia. 65. Assyrian queens from the time of Assurnaserpal II in the 9th century BC, the grave goods included incredible gold necklaces, earrings, and other treasures. These disappeared during the Second Gulf War but turned out to be hidden in a bank vault and have since been safely recovered and now published. Work elsewhere in the region has now resumed as well, after being suspended since the early 1990s. It will be interesting to see what the next century of archaeological expeditions uncovers. One of the most exciting developments in recent years within Maya studies took place in 2009. Using an advanced LiDAR system installed in a twin-engine airplane, a team of archaeologists was able to map the hidden Maya city of Caracol in Belize. In only 4 days, they were able to successfully demonstrate that a large area of what looked like impenetrable jungle actually contained buildings, roads, and other parts of a massive city that was completely hidden by the overgrowth. The name LiDAR stands for Light Detection and Ranging. It is a remote sensing technology that works like radar but uses light from a laser to produce highly accurate measurements by bouncing the laser beams off the ground and thereby creating three-dimensional images with hundreds of thousands of data points. It usually is used from an airplane and turns out to be especially useful in places like Central America, because it can map through the trees in a jungle or rainforest and provide images of lost temples, buildings, and even cities that are totally overgrown. 5. Exploring the jungles of Central America. Exploring the jungles of Central America. 67. The problem at all, or most, of these Maya sites is the forest of trees that grew over them and hid many of them from the outside world for so long. Even today, if the sites are not actively maintained and groomed for the hordes of tourists that visit, the forest would quickly reclaim the ruins. Still other cities remain hidden, which is why as recently as 2014 other research teams have continued to find other Maya cities that were completely overgrown elsewhere in the region. One of the researchers said that in the jungle, you can be as little as 600 feet from a large site and not even suspect it might be there. LiDAR can change all of that, for not only can it help locate lost cities, but it can map the ones that we know of in a matter of days or even hours, instead of the weeks and months, or even years, that it usually takes. PPPP. It was in the year 1750 that a party of Spaniards traveling in the interior of Mexico found, in the midst of a vast solitude, ancient stone buildings, the remains of a city. The Spanish explorers were no doubt stunned to see the huge buildings completely overgrown by vines and with trees growing through what had once been windows. We now know that they had found the Maya site of Palenque. Although the news spread quickly, little official attention was paid to it. It was not until more than 30 years later, in 1784, that the King of Spain sent another explorer to investigate the rumors. Although additional Spanish expeditions visited the site over the next 50 years, and even though accounts were eventually published in English in 1822 and 1835, still few people noticed. As a result, the discovery of Palenque was overlooked by most of the Western world until 1841, when a U.S. explorer named John Lloyd Stevens published an account of his own travels in the area and introduced it to a broad reading audience. Less than a decade before Layard began publishing about the remains he was finding in Mesopotamia. Stevens was astonished by the lack of attention that had been paid to Palenque before his book Incidents of Travel came out. After describing the initial discovery in 1750 and the subsequent investigations by the Spanish, he noted that if a like discovery had been made in Italy, Greece, Egypt, or Asia, within the reach of European travel, it would have created an interest not inferior to the discovery of Herculaneum. 68 Chapter 5. Or Pompeii, or the ruins of Paestum. His explorations of Central America with Frederick Catherwood, a British artist and architect, changed all that. Their journeys resulted in best-selling travel books, in which they reported on their discovery of several Maya sites, many of them previously unknown. Stevens and Catherwood were by no means the first outsiders to have visited these sites, of course, and rather than doing much actual excavation, they explored, cleared away trees and underbrush, surveyed, and drew. But because of the accounts that they subsequently published, they brought the ruins of Central America to the attention of the outside world. In the process, they established the beginnings of what we now call New World archaeology. As one scholar has pointed out, all this was done 30 years before Heinrich Schliemann dug at Troy and more than 80 years before Howard Carter discovered King Tut. Stevens had been trained in Greek and Latin as a very young student. He went to Columbia University when he was just 13 years old. A lawyer by the time he was 20, he didn't practice law for long. Instead, he began traveling across Europe and the Middle East, including Greece, Turkey, Egypt, and Jordan. He published an account of his journeys, which quickly became extremely popular, bringing him fame and fortune. Catherwood was several years older than Stevens, but having formed a friendship, the two men decided to explore Central America together. Specifically, they wanted to search for ruins belonging to the civilization that we now call the Maya. And so, in 1839, they set off from the United States with a goal of visiting three ancient Mesoamerican sites that they had read about: Copan, Palenque, and Uxmal. They got to those and many more, nearly 50 cities, including one called Chichen Itza, during two separate voyages of exploration. The accounts of these expeditions were published as travel volumes in 1841 and 1843. Within them, Stevens described in detail not only the cities and buildings that they saw, but also the various illnesses that they suffered during their trips. Several times he mentioned the mosquitoes that gave them malaria and the burrowing insects that laid eggs under their toenails, as well as other unpleasant ailments, some of which were life-threatening. It seems amazing, after reading through Exploring the Jungles of Central America 69. Their first-hand accounts, that they ever made it out of the jungle and back to the United States alive, let alone on two separate occasions. Stevens was an astute observer, someone who could compare and contrast what he had seen in the Old World with what he was now discovering in the New World. From his previous experiences traveling in the Middle East, he was able to conclude, quite correctly, that cities like Copan and Palenque were not built by Egyptians or survivors of Atlantis, both of which had been suggested previously, but rather by the indigenous people of the area, the Maya. After comparing and contrasting the pyramids, columns, and sculptures that he saw at Copan to those of the Egyptians, he wrote specifically, "Unless I am wrong, we have a conclusion far more interesting and wonderful than that of connecting the buildings of these cities with the Egyptians or any other people." Opposed, as is my idea, to all previous speculations, I am inclined to think that were constructed by the races who occupied the country at the time of the invasion by the Spaniards, or of some not very distant progenitors. He and Catherwood faithfully recorded the hieroglyphics that were engraved on monuments at Copan and elsewhere. Stephens was convinced that, once they were decoded, these hieroglyphics would reveal the history of the Maya. He wrote, "One thing I believe, its history is graven on its monuments. No Champollion has yet brought to them the energies of his inquiring mind. Who shall read them?" He came back to this point again, writing, "I cannot help believing that the hieroglyphics will yet be read." For centuries the hieroglyphics of Egypt were inscrutable, and, though not perhaps in our day, I feel persuaded that a key surer than that of the Rosetta Stone will be discovered. Stephens was referring to Jean-François Champollion, who deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics by 1823 by studying the trilingual inscription on the Rosetta Stone. He was completely correct. When the hieroglyphics engraved on the monuments were finally deciphered, they did turn out to record the history of the Maya, in all its gory detail. It took quite a long time, until just the past few decades in fact, for us to be able to read the inscriptions accurately, but now we know that the Maya were not quite so peaceful as we previously thought and that their history was as full of rivalries and wars as any other ancient civilization. 70 Chapter 5. It took the concerted efforts of a number of individuals to crack the Mayan writing system, including an Englishman named Eric Thompson, a Russian-American scholar named Tatiana Proskuryakov, and a Ukrainian scholar named Yuri Norisov. Thompson and Norisov are usually described as bitter rivals, somewhat along the same lines as Jean-François Champollion and Thomas Young, when the French and British scholars were racing to see who would decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics first. Thompson was the grand old man of Mayan hieroglyphic studies, with a major volume published in 1950. Proskuryakov was the first to show that the hieroglyphics recorded historical dates and events. She was also able to identify specific women in the texts, as opposed to men. But it is now recognized that it was Norisov, working in Stalinist Russia during the Cold War, who made the ultimate breakthrough in reading the texts, by making use of a manuscript on the Maya left to us by the 16th century CE Spanish bishop Diego de Landa. Although de Landa's own understanding of Mayan writing was misguided, his manuscript served as an essential key to Norisov. For that reason, de Landa's text has been called the Rosetta Stone of Mayan hieroglyphs. This is especially ironic since de Landa is generally regarded as the man responsible for destroying most of the known Maya barkfold books, which is why we have so few left today. Some of the most recent and significant advances in reading Mayan hieroglyphics have been made in the past few decades by a U.S. scholar named David Stewart. Born in 1965, he is the son of Mayanist George Stewart, who worked for the National Geographic Society for nearly 40 years. David had been accompanying his parents to Maya ruins since he was a 3-year-old toddler. By the age of 8, he was working on the hieroglyphs. By age 10, he was shadowing and helping the great Maya epigrapher Linda Skeel during her work at Palenque. By the time Stewart received his PhD in 1995, he had already published 13 articles and monographs. He is still the youngest person and one of the few archaeologists ever to be awarded a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, which he received when he was only 18. He's also one of the only people to have won both a MacArthur and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Exploring the Jungles of Central America 71. He is probably best known to the general public, however, for a book that he wrote in 2011, during the media frenzy about the supposed Maya prediction that the world would end in 2012 when the current Maya 5,000-year calendrical cycle completed. He successfully showed that the Maya had not, in fact, been trying to predict when the world was going to end, but rather were simply placing a specific king's reign into a larger context or cycle of time. It is thanks to all these individuals, and a handful of others, that John Lloyd Stephens's prediction came true. Mayan hieroglyphics have finally been deciphered, and the history of Copan and other Maya cities is indeed, as Stephens put it, graven on its monuments. We now know that at Copan, for instance, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Honduras, the Maya listed the names of 16 of their rulers, covering a period of about 4 centuries, from 427 CE until a little after 810 CE. They are carved on altar Q, a fairly small box-shaped stone, 6 feet wide by 6 feet long and standing 4 feet tall, with the rulers depicted 4 to a side. The founding king of this dynasty was a man known as Great Sun Green Quetzalcoatl. Although the site was primarily occupied from about 200–900 CE, these 4 centuries seem to have been the high point of its existence. We also know, both from studies of the inscriptions found at various sites and the excavations of those sites themselves, much more about the rise and fall of the Maya. Archaeologists split the history of the Maya into several main periods. The earliest attempts at agriculture and the first villages date to the Archaic period, before 2000 BCE. The pre-classic period lasted from about 2000 BCE to 300 CE, with cities arising by about 750 BCE, and the classic period stretched from approximately 300 CE to 900 CE. The terminal classic period, which saw the collapse of the complex cities of the Maya, makes up the last part of the classic period, in about 800–900 CE, though the dates vary in different areas. It was followed by the post-classic period, from about 900 CE until the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century CE. PPPP. Copan, which flourished during the classic period, was one of the 3 cities that John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood initially 72 Chapter 5 went looking for in November 1839. Stephens claims to have purchased the entire site of Copan from its local owners for the relatively paltry sum of $50 and thought seriously about how to ship all its monuments home, though he ended up simply having Catherwood draw them instead. However, the original contract has recently been found, and it seems that Stephens didn't really purchase the ancient site, but instead only leased it for a period of 3 years, which was far more time than Catherwood needed to draw the monuments. Stephens and Catherwood spent a total of 13 days at Copan, during which time they found 14 inscribed standing stones. These are usually called stelae, the Greek word used by archaeologists to refer to an upright standing stone that has an inscription. Catherwood drew all the stelae they found at Copan, as well as altar Q. Stephens had an inkling of what was depicted on altar Q, for he describes the 16 individuals pictured and mentions his suspicion that the hieroglyphics on which they were seated probably gave their name and office. Which indeed they do. He was also quite correct in suggesting that the hieroglyphics on the altar beyond doubt record some event in the history of the mysterious people who once inhabited the city. Stephens and Catherwood cleared the undergrowth from other ruins at Copan, including the Temple of the Hieroglyphic Stairway and the Sacred Ball Court. The hieroglyphic stairway has 63 stairs climbing 75 feet up to the top of the temple, with at least 2,200 hieroglyphs decorating its length. It is one of the longest Mayan texts known and appears to be a dynastic record. It was started by the unlucky 13th king of Copan, who was later captured in battle and beheaded while fighting a rival kingdom. It was doubled in length and completed by the 15th ruler in the 8th century CE, who also turned it into an odd bilingual text. The right-hand column contains Maya hieroglyphs, and the left-hand column has strange Teotihuacan hieroglyphs that seem to have no real meaning and are apparently more decorative than anything else. The ball court is one of the best examples of its kind ever found at a Maya site, although the rules of the game are still debated. Some say it was played somewhat like soccer. One way to win was by getting the Exploring the Jungles of Central America 73 ball through a small ring, but the game ended if the ball touched either the ground or anyone's hands. And although the winners were often treated as heroes, some scholars have argued that the losers were sometimes put to death. Ball courts are found throughout Mesoamerica and were even exported to the U.S. Southwest. Since Stephens and Catherwood were at the site for less than 2 weeks, it was left to others to continue the exploration and excavations of Copan. Among them were a well-known amateur archaeologist named Alfred Maudslay, who arrived in the 1880s, and then a team from the Carnegie Institution in the mid-1930s. After a break in their travels, Stephens and Catherwood went in search of Palenque in April 1840. Along the way, they had a chance to visit a site lost in the Guatemalan rainforest that was probably what we now know to be the major site of Tikal. Although they had heard rumors of its existence, and Stevens had figured out that they could allocate 10 days to get there, map it, and get back. They opted instead to head for Palenque without further delay and thus missed visiting the site, which was left for others to discover. Temple of the Grand Jaguar, Tikal. 74 Chapter 5. No doubt they later regretted this decision, especially after the announcement less than a decade later, in 1848, that Tikal had been located right where they thought it would be. Had they gone when they had the opportunity to do so, they would have received credit for finding one of the largest Maya cities in the region, where as many as 100,000 Maya may have once lived. Other archaeologists and explorers came through soon afterward, but it was more than a century before the University of Pennsylvania conducted the first large archaeological project at the site, from 1956-1970. Approximately 3,000 buildings are still visible at the site, although many are still covered by the tropical forest. They include temples and palaces, dating to the classic period of 200-900 CE, with most built during the final 3 centuries. George Stewart, the National Geographic archaeologist, estimated that there may be another 10,000 buildings from earlier periods still to be found at Tikal. It is now a national park, in addition to being named as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979. There are 6 temple pyramids at Tikal, including Temple 1, called the Temple of the Grand Jaguar. Within the temple, the tomb of the great Maya ruler who built it was found in 1962. His name is frequently translated as Lord Chocolate. He ruled Tikal for 52 years, on either side of 700 CE. Within his grave were found pieces of jade, shell ornaments, and ceramic vessels originally filled with food and drink. There were also some unusual carved bones, with scenes that appear to be from a Maya creation story. In addition to all the buildings, 10 reservoirs also were found at the site, which provided the city with its drinking water. Stevens and Catherwood were by no means the first Europeans to look for Palenque, of course. Their entire journey to the region had been sparked by the brief accounts that they had read about that lost city, which had been translated into English from reports filed by various Spanish explorers. Several of the reports attributed the massive ruins to the Egyptians, but at least one, written by the explorer Dupaix, who had also been to Copan during his explorations, concluded that Palenque had been built by people from Atlantis. Such hypotheses began from the erroneous assumption that the poor Maya natives living in small villages nearby could not possibly be the descendants of the Exploring the Jungles of Central America 75. Same folks who built these magnificent structures. They must have been built by a people known to the Europeans, that is, Egyptians, Romans, Atlanteans, and the like. Stevens was going against such opinions when he declared that Palenque, and the other ruins, had been built by the indigenous Maya, seeing no reason to involve people from elsewhere. After a difficult journey, Stevens and Catherwood finally reached Palenque, in southern Mexico, in May 1840. They were able to spend 3 weeks at the site, clearing away the trees and jungle growth in order to draw the standing monuments and buildings, including the so-called palace, the Temple of the Cross, and the large ball court. Among the structures that they uncovered was one that we now call the Temple of the Inscriptions, which stood on top of an 80-foot-tall stone pyramid. The temple is justifiably famous for the 3 huge tablets with more than 600 hieroglyphics on them, the second longest inscription known from the Maya world. Stevens was certain that the hieroglyphics were identical in nature to the ones they had seen at Copan, and so he had Catherwood copy them exactly, in case a future scholar could decipher them, which is precisely what eventually happened. It wasn't as easy as it sounds. The description that Stevens gave of what they had to do first, in order for Catherwood to produce his drawings, gives us some idea of the effort involved. He says, "When we first saw them, were covered with a thick coat of green moss, and it was necessary to wash and scrape them, clear the lines with a stick, and scrub them thoroughly. On account of the darkness of the corridor from the thick shade of the trees growing before it, it was necessary to burn candles or torches, and to throw a strong light upon the stones while Mr. Catherwood was drawing." Unbeknownst to them, the 80-foot-tall pyramid on which the Temple of the Inscriptions stood also served as the burial place for Lord Pacal, who ruled at Palenque for almost 70 years, from 615 to 683 CE. Like King Tut in Egypt almost 2,000 years earlier, Pacal also came to the throne as a child, but unlike Tut, he lived and ruled to a ripe old age. Pechel's tomb was not found until 1952, more than a century after Stevens and Catherwood had explored the site, and exactly 30 years after Howard Carter had discovered Tut's tomb. 76 Chapter 5. It was a Mexican archaeologist named Alberto Rusluwilier who discovered the tomb. He became curious about a stone slab in the floor of the Temple of the Inscriptions, at the very top of the pyramid. The slab had a double row of circular depressions with stone plugs in them, which he figured were meant to help remove the slab. He did exactly that, revealing a stairway completely filled with rubble, which led down into the supporting pyramid. It took his team several years to clear the long stairwell and reach the bottom 80 feet below where they had started, where they found Pechel's tomb. Essentially, the tomb is at ground level, but inside the pyramid. It is now thought that the tomb was built first and then the pyramid was constructed around it. Pechel himself was laid to rest within a limestone coffin or sarcophagus that is 13 feet long. It has a complicated carving on its lid depicting Pechel descending to the underworld. At first, the archaeologists didn't realize that the lid covered a sarcophagus. They thought the whole structure was a solid stone altar, with the carving on the top of the altar. It was only when they drilled a small exploratory hole in the stone that they realized it was hollow, not solid. Within the sarcophagus, in which Pechel's skeleton rested undisturbed, a jade mask was found still on his face, where it had been placed 1,300 years ago. An amazing number of other jade objects also were found, including necklaces, ear ornaments, a diadem and a ring, pectorals, wristlets, 2 statuettes, and a belt. The skeletons of 6 other people, who had apparently been sacrificed in order to accompany Pechel into the afterlife, were found with his body. In 1987, Palenque was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It has been a magnet for more recent explorers and archaeologists as well, including discoveries of new buildings and burials from 1993 to 2000. Among the discoveries is the so-called Red Queen, who was found in 1994 with a tremendous cache of grave goods within an elaborate chamber in Temple 13. This temple is close to Pechel's burial pyramid, and it has been suggested that the Red Queen may have been Pechel's wife, who died about 10 years before he did. The Palenque mapping project was also busy at the site during 1998-2000, surveying and mapping the buildings, including some that were still hidden in the forest. From Palenque, Stevens and Catherwood continued to the third site on their list, called Uxmal. Soon thereafter, though, they called a exploring the jungles of Central America 77. Halt to their explorations because Catherwood became quite ill. They had both suffered terribly during the journey, with recurring bouts of malaria for each of them. They had been gone for 10 months, and it was time to go home to New York. Although this involved another series of adventures, including almost dying on the ship sailing for home, they returned to the United States in July 1840, and Stevens promptly published a 2-volume set of their adventures, complete with illustrations by Catherwood. It appeared in June 1841. By that December, 20,000 copies had been sold, at the relatively affordable price of $5 for the 2-volume set. Soon they made plans to return for a second time to the Yucatan region, leaving in October 1841, just 4 months after the release of their book. This time, they were gone for 8 months, eventually returning to the United States in June 1842, and with the volumes describing this second voyage appearing by February 1843. The highlight of this second journey was their exploration of the site of Chichen Itza, near the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. They spent 18 days there, hiring local workers to help them remove the trees, underbrush, and other debris from a number of buildings at the site, including the Temple of the Jaguars, the Temple of the Warriors, the Pyramid of Kukulkan, and the Platform of Venus. The stairway at Kukulkan, also known as El Castillo, is formed in such a way that the shadow of a giant serpent can be seen at the spring equinox. It is visited by thousands of tourists each year. Some of these, such as the Temple of the Jaguars and the Temple of the Warriors, contain murals and scenes depicting the conquest of this area by the Toltecs, led by Tepiltz and Quetzalcoatl. The Toltecs were a group of newcomers who arrived from Mexico during the last 2 centuries of occupation at the site, around 1200 CE. The murals indicate that the invaders first arrived by sea and beat the Maya defenders, who came out to meet them in canoes. They then fought a great battle against those same Maya and defeated them again. At the site is also an astronomical observatory, a long stone skull rack featuring a number of skulls carved in stone, undoubtedly to simulate real ones, and a huge ball court, which is the largest in Mesoamerica and which Stevens described at length. Many of these structures date from the time of the Toltec occupation at the site, replacing were built. 78 Chapter 5. In addition to the earlier Maya structures, for Chichen Itza flourished later than most of the other Maya sites, reaching its peak in 800–1200 CE, partly because of the arrival of the Toltecs during the midpoint of the period. Although Stevens and Catherwood visited the site in 1841, 1842, and Maudslay came to see it in 1886, it wasn't until Edward Thompson came to the site in 1895 that Chichen Itza began to be explored systematically. Thompson's excavations covered a period of 30 years. It then took almost another century before it was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988. Thompson's excavations included dredging one of the cenotes at the site. For those readers who were unfamiliar with cenotes, Stevens gave a good definition in his book, describing them as immense circular holes, from 60 to 200 feet in diameter, with broken, rocky, perpendicular sides from 50 to 100 feet deep, and having at the bottom a great body of water. There were two at Chichen Itza, of which he says one was the largest and wildest we had seen. He describes it as being in the middle of a thick forest, with a mysterious influence pervading it. He was well aware of the tradition that human victims had been thrown into it and identified one building right on the edge as perhaps the place from which the victims were thrown into the dark well beneath. During the dredging and exploration of this cenote by Thompson and others, human remains were indeed found, including the skeletons of at least 50 victims, young women, men, and a number of children. Objects of jade and gold discs also were found, as were copper bells and other items. It is clear that sacrifices of many kinds were made at this cenote over the years. The sacrifices were not just by the Maya, for many of the objects are of later Toltec manufacture. Pppp. There are numerous other Maya cities, both large and small, that we could also describe, but these four, Copan, Tikal, Palenque, and Chichen Itza, are fairly representative overall. Although we now know a lot about the Maya and their civilization, what is still a mystery is why it came to an end just after 900 CE, with all or most of the great sites. Exploring the jungles of Central America 79. Abandoned and subsequently overgrown and lost to the rest of the world. A favorite suggestion has been that they were unable to deal with a century-long drought, that is, climate change, but this is by no means certain. Numerous other hypotheses also have been put forward, including explanations that involve overpopulation and deforestation. But there may not even be a single answer, and it would take an entire book to discuss the various possibilities for the collapse of the Maya. The one thing that is clear at the moment is that, for this mystery to be resolved once and for all, more investigation, and quite possibly more excavation, is definitely needed. What we can say, though, is that the discovery of the Maya represents the first detection of a previously unknown civilization by archaeologists in the New World. The Spanish already knew about the Inca and the Aztecs, but the Maya were unfamiliar to the general public until the explorations by John Lloyd Stevens and Frederick Catherwood. Their publications challenged the assumption that Native Americans were simply poor villagers deserving of conquest by more advanced Europeans and that they were incapable of achievements along the lines of the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. Subsequent investigations have resulted in the successful translation of their extensive written records and have shown that they were as complex politically, militarily, and culturally as the better-known civilizations of the Old World. Having spent the previous chapters discussing some of the earliest archaeological discoveries made around the world, from Egypt to Central America, I'd like to change gears for a moment. This interlude will be the first of several scattered throughout the book, in which I will address the questions that I am most frequently asked about how archaeologists do their job. Archaeology is both a technique and a craft, and knowing how it is done is part of its story as well. For instance, we are often asked, how do you know where to dig? That's a great question that bears on some of the essential tools and methods archaeologists employ. In this chapter, we'll answer that question by discussing archaeological surveying, that is, the process of looking for sites on the ground surface, because some are obvious, but others are not. Surface survey also can help us to figure out where to dig at an already known site. DIGGINGDEEPR1. How do you know where to dig? How do you know where to dig? 81. First and foremost, though, we need to define what we mean by a site, because they come in all shapes and sizes. For example, the Agora in Athens and huge mounds like Megiddo in Israel, both of which I've excavated at, are clearly ancient sites. But others can be tiny and very hard to find. As Fagan and Durrani point out, a site can be as small as a tiny scatter of hunter-gatherer artifacts or as large as the ancient city of Teotihuacan in Mexico. They are simply places where traces of past human activity are to be found, normally identified by the presence of artifacts. We should also define what an artifact is and isn't. Quite simply, artifacts make up most of the good stuff that is worth writing home about when on an excavation or a survey. They are things made or altered by human beings. Within this category, we include everything from the earliest stone tools to pottery, weapons, jewelry, clothes, and pretty much everything else portable that humans can make. Some artifacts, however, and things associated with them, can't be moved. We call these features. And so, something like a ditch is a feature. It's obviously made by a human, but you can't move it without losing it. The same goes for doorways, fire pits, stone altars, and other similar items. Sometimes, though, we also call something a feature when we're just not quite sure yet what it is, but we know it's a something. That's why we say, 1 stone is a stone, 2 stones is a feature, 3 stones is a wall. PPPP. There are several ways to find sites, but almost all involve conducting what we call archaeological surveys. Within this broad category are ground surveys, aerial surveys, remote sensing, and sample surveys, most of which we will touch upon in this interlude. In all instances, the goal is to find sites that lie within a specific area, like the region around Pylos in southern Greece, where I once surveyed. The traditional way to do a ground survey is to have team members physically walk the area in question and see what remains are there. These are frequently called reconnaissance surveys or full coverage surveys, but they also can be referred to as pedestrian surveys, for obvious reasons. In some areas, however, like regions of the northeastern United 82 digging deeper 1. States where it can be nearly impossible to see things because of the vegetation, ground surveys are sometimes conducted by digging small shovel test pits every few yards, to see whether there is any evidence of artifacts beneath the ground. The density of objects that turn up determines whether these areas can be mapped as a site or not. Ground surveys first began to be popular in the 1960s and 1970s and then gained traction in the 1980s, in part because they are usually a cheaper alternative to digging and can cover larger areas. They also allow archaeologists to ask and answer different types of questions than when digging a single site, since they frequently involve multiple sites. For instance, someone may want to investigate how intensively a specific area in Greece was occupied during the Bronze Age and later periods, the Dark Ages, Archaic and Classical Greece, Roman and Byzantine periods, and the Turkish Ottoman Age. Did the settlement pattern change during the following eras? Can the number of sites and their size tell us the relative population of various time periods? Can changes in where people settled tell us about what resources they were using, how dangerous their environment was? What the political situation was like? Ground surveys can help provide answers for these kinds of questions. By doing surveys and identifying the various sites from different periods in the area, it is frequently possible to construct a history of the region without ever digging at a single site. Many surveys lead into an excavation afterward, though, especially when the archaeologists decide to concentrate on one of the promising new sites that they have just found and get a permit to dig. Times have now changed, and these days, instead of always beginning with a ground survey, it sometimes makes more sense to start with aerial surveys, at least in areas where the ancient inhabitants erected buildings or otherwise left remains made from durable materials that might still be discernible. This can be as simple as buying aerial photographs or satellite images from specific companies, or as complicated and expensive as arranging for overhead flights using LiDAR to survey your area. If you want to buy imagery, which is by far the easiest way to go, there are a few options. One possibility is to purchase declassified military satellite images like the ones taken by the Corona program. How do you know where to dig? 83. Corona program was a surveillance operation conducted by U.S. intelligence agencies from 1960 to 1972. Images from the program were declassified by an executive order in 1995 and are now used for all sorts of purposes, including finding archaeological sites. Sites can sometimes be seen very clearly even in these older images, either with the naked eye, by enlarging it on a computer screen, or by looking at it with a magnifying glass. Older photos like these can be very valuable. Aerial photos for warfare, spying, or general reconnaissance have been taken for 100 years. Some of them are useful in part because they were taken before recent economic development or urban expansion destroyed or damaged archaeological sites. One of the earliest examples is that of John Bradford, an archaeologist who was serving in the British Army during World War II. In 1943, while studying photographs taken by the Royal Air Force for military purposes, he was able to locate more than 2,000 Etruscan burial mounds in northern Italy, simply from the differences in color of the grass or soil visible in the pictures. Subsequently, Bradford joined forces in 1956 with an Italian engineer from Milan named Carlo Larisai and, from 1957 onward, they explored many of the Etruscan tombs that Bradford had first identified on the aerial photographs by drilling into the earth with a small high-speed auger or drill at these locations. Initially they inserted a hollow pipe with a small spy camera inside and took photographs of the interior of the tombs, but soon they developed what is known as the Larisai periscope, which was specially designed with a powerful light that could fit into the narrow hole that had been drilled. This instrument helped them to quickly look inside the tombs without having to wait for photographic film to be developed, and to identify which tombs had already been looted, in either antiquity or in modern times, and which still contained ancient remains and even frescoes painted on the walls. In this way they were able to investigate several hundred tombs per season without excavating or damaging them in any way. There is also the option of getting up-to-the-minute high-resolution contemporary color satellite images from companies like Digital Globe or images that have been taken from the space shuttle. For example, there's a fairly well-known picture of the ancient city of Angkor in 84 Digging Deeper 1. Cambodia that was taken from the Space Shuttle Endeavour, in which all the buildings that are still standing can be seen very clearly. My colleague Sarah Parkak, who is a National Geographic explorer and associate professor at the University of Alabama, but is perhaps better known as the space archaeologist and winner of the $1 million TED Prize in 2016, surveys using satellite images. The images allow her to use all kinds of fancy techniques, like infrared imaging, to illuminate some features and suppress others. Using these techniques, she found several hundred previously undiscovered sites in Egypt, including 17 lost pyramids as well as the nearly legendary site of Tanis, all of which were hiding in plain sight, as she puts it. Such new techniques with satellite imagery have enhanced our ability to see things that were previously essentially invisible, including ancient paths crisscrossing a desert. That's how the lost city of Ubar in Oman was found in 1992. Endeavour had taken a picture of the area and archaeologists noticed where the ancient paths converged. They subsequently excavated there and found the ancient site. Buried walls, earthworks, and other large constructions associated with settlements often can be seen more easily from the air than they can be seen on the ground, even if one is walking right over them. In a raking light, or if an aerial photograph is taken at a slight angle, shadows cast by buried walls are sometimes visible. More commonly, aerial photos can illuminate crop marks. Crop marks document the location of buried items precisely, whether they are features like ditches or structures like buildings and walls. The simple reason is that those buried items affect the amount of water absorbed by the soil, and thus the color and height of the vegetation that is growing directly above them. This won't work if there is something built on top of them, like a modern parking lot, but it will work in a field where grass, wheat, barley, or thick weeds are growing. If there is a buried ditch below the modern surface, the vegetation growing directly above it will be higher and lusher than the surrounding vegetation, because there are more water and nutrients in the soil right there. If there is a buried wall below the modern surface, on the other hand, the vegetation growing directly above it will be lower, less dense, and less lush than the surrounding vegetation, because there are fewer nutrients in the soil at that location. How do you know where to dig? 85. These differences in height and density might be almost imperceptible at ground level, but from the air they are immediately obvious at certain times of the year. In England and in Europe, especially in Italy, crop marks that are about 3 feet wide and run straight as an arrow across the fields indicate the presence of buried Roman roads. Others that are round, like the ones that John Bradford saw in the Royal Air Force photographs of northern Italy, may indicate the presence of buried tombs. I often amuse myself when I'm on a flight that is landing somewhere in Europe by looking out the window of the airplane as we are descending and trying to see if I can discern any crop marks in the fields surrounding the airport. It's amazing how many times I've seen something that I'd love to go back and excavate, in order to figure out what it was. At one point, in January 2010, Sarah Parkak and I bought some QuickBird satellite imagery of the area surrounding Megiddo in Israel, just as an experiment to see what we might be able to locate by using her new methods of analysis. Almost immediately we saw the outlines of what looked like a large building in a field right next to the ancient mound. Precisely where an Israeli archaeologist named Yotam Tepper previously suggested that the 6th Roman legion, Legio VI Ferrata, had built their camp in the 2nd century CE. When we compared the outlines to other known sites and buildings, we found an almost perfect match with other Roman camps, like those that were built around the site of Masada when the Romans besieged it back in 73 or 74 CE. It was clear to us that we must be looking at the site of Legio, where the 6th Legion had its headquarters, and that Tepper had been correct. We shared the images with Tepper and Matt Adams, the director of the Jezreel Valley Regional Project, and when they began excavating in that field in 2013 and then again in 2015, after first conducting additional remote sensing work, including ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic surveys, they immediately came down upon the remains of ditches and walls, along with Roman period coins, bits of scale armor, and, most important, fragments of roof tiles. The tiles were stamped with the legion's insignia, thus confirming that this was indeed their camp. 86 Digging Deeper 1. As mentioned above, archaeologists have also added LiDAR to their toolkit. It's most useful in places like Central America or Southeast Asia, because it can see through the trees in a jungle or rainforest, by the firing of lasers at the ground, and provide images of lost temples, buildings, and even cities that are completely overgrown and almost inaccessible now. Like the Maya city of Caracol in Belize that was found in 2010. In June 2016, archaeologists working in Cambodia announced that they had found previously undocumented medieval cities not far from the ancient temple city of Angkor Wat. That promised to upend key assumptions about Southeast Asia's history. The cities are between 900 and 1400 years old and were found by Australian archaeologist Damien Evans, who used LiDAR data captured by an instrument mounted in a helicopter during an aerial survey in 2015 that fully covered 734 square miles. Evans believes that the colossal, densely populated cities would have constituted the largest empire on Earth at the time of its peak in the 12th century. Other archaeologists agree with his assessment, saying that these are the most significant archaeological discoveries in the region in the past century. LiDAR also is useful in areas without tremendous amounts of vegetation and has been used to map the site of Jezreel in northern Israel and is yet another way to locate Roman roads in England. We've also used it at ground level at our site at Tel Kabri in Israel to quickly and accurately record the wine cellar that we found in 2013, which I described at the beginning of this book. Most recently, archaeologists have added commercial drones to their toolkit as well, flying the drones much as hobbyists fly model airplanes, both to find and document sites and to detect looting. From them, it is possible to take either low or high-level photos of a region, sometimes sending the results directly to a computer for future manipulation and analysis. There are other remote sensing techniques that are ground-based and can help to figure out whether there is something under the ground where one might want to dig. They include electronic resistivity or conductivity, which basically works by running an electric current through the ground between two poles. If there is something like a buried wall in the way, it will interrupt the current. If there isn't, it won't be. How do you know where to dig? 87. Interrupted. The end result is a rather fuzzy picture of what is below ground, but often it is not clear exactly how far below the surface the ancient remains are or even if the images are being interpreted correctly. This is where something called ground truthing comes in. Ground truthing means double-checking or confirming what has been spotted in the photographs or remote sensing images to make certain it is real or has been properly interpreted. It frequently involves foot surveys or actual excavation. Thus, at our site of Tel Kabri in northern Israel, electric conductivity images taken in 2003 indicated that there were probably walls in the area that we were interested in, and so in 2005 we went to ground truth the area by excavating to see whether they were accurate. It took us more than 2 weeks of digging through totally sterile soil before we came upon the walls and floors belonging to our Canaanite palace, but they were there, fully 6 feet below the present surface. The same principles work with magnetometers, which measure the magnetic field in areas that are of interest to archaeologists. If there are buildings or ditches or other archaeological features that are buried underground, they may show up on a magnetometer reading, because such features affect the magnetic field in the area. The limitations of these techniques are the same. Although they show anomalies below the surface that stand out from the general soil, it can be difficult to pin down whether the anomalies match certain kinds of subsurface structures. The consistency of soil below the surface can also determine whether the anomalies can stand out against it, and the readings don't always let you know how deep the features are located. Different methods might give results that look different. In each case, excavation is needed to confirm what the remote sensing device identifies. For some or all of these reasons, our attempts to use a magnetometer at Tel Kabri in Israel failed rather miserably, most likely because of the nature of the soil that we have at the site. On the other hand, at David Schlon's excavations at Zincirli in Turkey, a magnetometer survey worked so well that the results look like a photograph of excavated ruins, except that the ruins are still buried and haven't yet been excavated. As mentioned earlier, the excavators at Troy tried several types. 88 Digging Deeper 1 of magnetometers before they finally found one kind, a cesium magnetometer, that yielded results. They were then able to map an entire lower town at Troy, buried under the agricultural fields around the mound. Teams had been excavating the mound since the days of Schliemann in the late 1800s, but nobody had thought to excavate in the fields next to it, because it looked like nothing was there. But remember also that in their early days they failed to ground truth the images of the supposed wall encircling Troy, which turned out to be a large ditch instead. Troy is not the only place where ground truthing should have been done before releasing reports to the media. Another common remote sensing technique is ground penetrating radar, which works exactly as it sounds, by having radar signals bounce back up from buried objects. The newest versions of this technique are extremely powerful and can see down nearly 4 meters. This has resulted in some incredible discoveries from the area of Stonehenge in England in 2014 and 2015, including the fact that Stonehenge was apparently once a complete circle. Here, using ground-penetrating radar, as well as magnetometers and other remote sensing techniques, archaeologists have been involved in something called the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes Project. According to media reports, in just a few years of work, they have detected tractor and ground-penetrating radar near Stonehenge. How do you know where to dig? 89. Bronze Age burial mounds, Iron Age shrines, and enclosures for cows and other livestock that date to either the Bronze Age or Iron Age, none of which had ever been noticed before. Most exciting were the reports in September 2014 that they also had found another monument of standing stones at Dinnington Walls, which is less than 2 miles from Stonehenge and which probably dates to about the same time, that is, 4,500 years ago. Apparently dwarfing Stonehenge in size and therefore dubbed Superhenge, it was thought to be a C-shaped enclosure created by more than 50, and perhaps as many as 90, giant stones, each about 10 to 15 feet long and 5 feet in diameter. None was visible, since they appeared to have been deliberately buried horizontally about 3 feet below the surface, which is why they hadn't been spotted before. It was only through remote sensing techniques that they were first detected and reported. 2 years later, however, in 2016, additional reports in the media noted that trial excavations had been conducted in the interim, in order to ground truth the remote sensing images by digging to reveal 2 of the huge stones. What the archaeologists found instead surprised them: no giant stones, but rather 2 enormous pits that may have once held huge timber posts. The posts are no longer present, for they had been removed at some point, if they were ever there, and the pits filled in with chalk rubble. The remote sensing instruments had registered the rubble as solid rock, giving rise to the original reports of giant stones instead of the debris-filled pits that they actually were. If the same is true of all the other reported stones as well, then we have the same situation as at Troy, where the fortification wall turned out to be a filled-in ditch. Some media reports are now calling Superhenge a timber circle complex 500 meters in diameter, but note that it was never completed. Whether that is correct remains to be seen, but the sequence of events has become a cautionary tale, and we should wait until the archaeologists have completed their work and published their findings in a peer-reviewed journal before further assumptions and hypotheses are made. Although there have been big advances made in remote sensing in the past couple of decades, sometimes satellite imagery and other high-tech solutions don't help at all in a search for sites. In those cases, 90 Digging Deeper 1. Archaeologists must resort to the tried and true methods of finding archaeological sites on foot. Sometimes this is as simple as taking advantage of the natural erosion that has taken place and keeping a sharp eye out while walking through potential areas. That, for instance, is how Donald Johanson found the first remains of Lucy in 1974, as we shall see. Other times, it might be a better idea to conduct an organized ground survey, in which sites, structures, features, and artifacts can be seen directly on the ground. These techniques go back to the origins of archaeology and were made more systematic in the 1960s and 1970s. We used these methods on the 2 archaeological surveys in Greece that I participated in, as well as a survey in Israel, so I can attest to exactly what's involved when doing a site survey in one of these areas. These kinds of surveys are conducted throughout the world, limited only by visibility of materials on the ground and by permission of the landowners. PPPP. There are 2 types of ground surveys that are used in certain areas of the world. As has been mentioned, one type is conducted on a large scale and is intended to cover large areas quickly. This is the reconnaissance or full coverage survey. The goal of these surveys is to create a map showing the location of possible ancient sites in a large landscape. The other type is an intensive survey that usually involves the examination of a single site or a small area that was initially discovered during the larger survey and flagged as being particularly promising. In this case, the goal is to be able to identify as much as possible about the specifics of the location, its extent, age, cultural affiliation, and range of material objects, often as a prelude to excavation. The archaeologists will do a very detailed investigation of the site or a small area that may involve picking up and bringing back to the camp every single artifact that they find there. Archaeologists working in an area where no comprehensive map exists of ancient sites from different time periods will start with a general reconnaissance survey. If done systematically and on foot, by having the team members painstakingly walk over every square meter of. How do you know where to dig? 91. The area, it is called a full coverage survey. This is what we did in the region of Boeotia near the city of Thebes in Greece back in the early 1980s, and again near the Mycenaean palace of Pylos in the early 1990s. At Pylos, we were split into 3 teams of about 6 people each. I was in charge of Team A, which we promptly renamed the A Team. At first we were assigned to survey the mountain heights on one side of the valley, despite my protestations that I was afraid of heights. Sure enough, on the very first day, as we began our survey, I froze. I had to be manhandled back to the car from one sheer drop. It was hardly an auspicious start for the team or the team leader. Later we were able to move lower and I had no problems from then on, but I learned a valuable lesson that I still draw on to this day: listen to your team members, especially if they tell you about a phobia that might affect their duties. Once we started to get into the swing of things, we got our routine down. First we would find our location on a contemporary map, usually a readily discernible item such as a road. This is much easier today with GPS systems. We would then spread out, about 30 feet apart, so that we covered a total of about 180 feet. When I shouted or blew a whistle, each person would start walking forward in the designated direction and walk in a straight line until reaching a specific predetermined point, usually another road or a boundary wall that also was marked on the map. This meant walking about the length of an US football field at a time, about 100 yards or meters, because more than that became complicated. This is what is known in archaeological surveying terms as walking a transect. And when I say walking in a straight line, I mean quite literally walking in a straight line, regardless of whether that meant fording a stream, rappelling, or falling down a small cliff, or facing down a bull or a local farmer with a shotgun who didn't want us on the land. All those things happened either to me or to other people on our team, but what was much more frequent was ripping our legs to shreds, even through our pants, because we had to walk right through the underbrush, which in Greece is known as the maki. That stuff can be nasty. While we walked, we scoured the ground, looking for pottery sherds, stone tools and flakes, ancient walls, or anything else that might. 92. Digging deeper. 1. Have marked the remains of an ancient settlement. By the way, it's always easy to identify someone who has just spent several weeks on an archaeological survey, because they're always the ones who spot the pennies and other loose change on the ground when they get back to civilization. Each team member carries a clicker and clicks once every time they see a pottery sherd, a worked piece of stone, or another type of artifact. 3 pieces of pottery get 3 clicks, 5 pieces get 5, and so on. At the end of every 10 steps or so, each team member writes down the number that is on their clicker, which is the number of artifacts they saw during that small section, resets it to 0, and starts walking and counting again. By the time they have reached the end point of the transect, they have a record of the number of the artifacts that they saw during each stage of the 100-yard walk. Why is that important? Durable items like pottery, stone, and metal are common on the surface from archaeological structures below the ground, brought there by farming, erosion, rodents, irrigation ditches, pits, and a host of other natural and human processes. When walking across a site that was inhabited in Bronze Age, Iron Age, Roman, and Byzantine times, you will see potsherds and stone tools from all those periods simply lying on the ground. If the numbers are recorded via a clicker, they will increase astronomically as you enter the boundaries of the site. After exiting the boundary of the site on the other side, the numbers will decrease again. The clicker counts for a team member, again recording the number of pieces of pottery and worked stone seen every 10 paces or so, will be something like this: 1, 5, 25, 107, 510, 423, 298, 152, 87, 0. And the numbers for the people immediately adjacent to the team member, on either side, will probably be similar, because they are likely to have walked across that same site. Those further out, however, if their transect did not cross the site, will have normal background scatter of artifact counts, for example, 1, 6, 4, 12, 0, 5, 3, 8, 5, 0. The team members give their numbers to the team leader, who records them in a notebook and marks the probable site on the map, so that the follow-up team can find it again and examine it more thoroughly. And then, the team members spread out again to cover the next section. Again, they march a predetermined distance, clicking as they. How do you know where to dig? 93. Go, repeating the process again and again, until they reach the end of the designated area. They then swing around, spread out once again, and return the way that they came, covering the next segment in the transect, and repeating the process over and over. In this way, a team can traverse and record all of the sites in a square mile or kilometer or whatever they choose each day, until the whole region has been covered. Back at camp, the results of each day's survey are recorded, and from these results a map of potential sites is developed. The most promising of the new possible sites then receive a visit from a team of experienced surveyors, who are tasked with doing an intensive survey of the newly discovered area. The surveyors record the surface finds more carefully and collect representative objects from the site to document it for future researchers. In our case, the objects consisted mostly of pottery sherds that, because of their size, location on a pot, manufacture techniques, or decoration, helped the pottery experts on the team figure out what periods they came from. Those are the survey methods that we used near Pylos in the 1990s, and the same methods are often employed today elsewhere in the world. But if the ground is covered with a thick coating of leaves, as in thickly forested areas, or if natural processes have covered the ancient landscape with more recent soil, or if the ancient people did not construct large structures of durable material, which is the case in the northeastern United States, survey techniques will differ. Places where objects were made from wood, fiber, or other perishable materials also don't work for this kind of survey. Thus, although pedestrian surveys are widely employed in the eastern United States along river floodplains where farmers have been plowing the fields, they are not used in heavily wooded areas. When the size of the region is too large for a full coverage survey, there are techniques to cover only specific portions, or randomly chosen portions, of an area. Here, the areas to explore are often derived from sampling techniques used in statistics and are called sample surveys. There is one other type of ground survey to mention. This is a targeted type of survey, which involves only revisiting sites that have been previously discovered. It is the type of survey that we did in the area around Tel Kabri in northern Israel during 2006 and 2007. We had 94 digging deeper 1. Already done some preliminary digging at the site in 2005 and had determined that we wanted to start a long-term multi-season excavation. First, though, we wanted to understand its context. What did the area around Tel Kabri look like before, during, and after its heyday in the Middle Bronze Age, almost 4,000 years ago? Fortunately, it was easy for us to do such a targeted survey of known sites because the Western Galilee, where Kabri is located, has been investigated previously by several teams of archaeologists doing full coverage surveys in almost every season and under almost every condition imaginable during the past 30 years or more. We already had maps of the area, with all the known Middle Bronze Age sites marked on them. We also had access to the pottery and other artifacts that had been collected and stored by the previous teams of archaeologists. Maps and survey reports in hand, we drove to the sites that were already known and simply did an intensive survey of each site around Tel Kabri and its hinterland. Our goal was to confirm and refine the dates previously assigned to the sites. We also wanted to recheck how large each site was. In the end, we were able to produce a map showing the sites that were inhabited in the area just before, during, and after the time that Kabri had flourished as a major center almost 4,000 years ago. And so, the answer to the question posed at the beginning of this interlude, how do you know where to dig, boils down to one word: surveying, because once an area has been surveyed, it's pretty easy to decide where you want to dig. As to how one actually digs, that's a whole different story, which we will discuss in another interlude. PA-RT 2. Africa, Europe, and the Levant, Early Hominins to Farmers. In 2015, the October issue of National Geographic magazine featured a story about an exciting discovery made by Lee Berger and his team in a South African cave called Rising Star. After being notified by 2 recreational cavers that they had seen bones covering a floor deep within the cave, Berger's team began investigating and eventually found more than 1,500 bones from at least 15 individuals, which he thinks belonged to a previously unknown hominin species. They have been named Homo naledi, after the cave in which they were found. Naledi means star in the Sesotho language, and hominin, a term used throughout this chapter, refers to modern humans, extinct human species, and all of our immediate ancestors. The bones may be up to 2.8 million years old. They were all found in the almost inaccessible chamber in the cave in 2013 and 2014, after the 2 spelunkers showed Berger how to get there. As Jamie Shreve of National Geographic describes it, this required going through a 6. Discovering our earliest ancestors. 98 Chapter 6. Passageway known as Superman's Crawl, which is less than 10 inches high and can be traversed only if you hold one arm tight against your body and extend the other above your head, like Superman when he is flying, then climbing up a vertical wall of jagged rock called the Dragon's Back, and then, after a number of other twists and turns, finally squeezing through a passage that at one point narrows to only 7.5 inches wide, before reaching the Dinaledi chamber in which the bones lie. The 6 scientists who subsequently retrieved the bones over a 2-year period were all experienced women archaeologists who were small enough to fit through all these passageways. According to Shreve, Berger advertised on Facebook that he needed skinny individuals, with scientific credentials and caving experience who were willing to work in cramped quarters. He heard from 60 applicants in just 10 days and chose those 6, whom he called underground astronauts. Their findings are extremely exciting, though not without a certain amount of controversy. If these are deliberate burials, as Berger hypothesizes, it would mean that we may be looking at some of the earliest examples of human self-consciousness, possibly an understanding of past and future. Perhaps even a sense of religion going back millions of years, because otherwise the bodies would have been left to lie where the individuals had died, rather than being deliberately brought to this part of the cave. It is, as some have described, a mind-numbing possibility, game-changing for those studying human evolution. Some scholars have taken issue with Berger's use of teams of young anthropologists from around the world to study the body parts and the rapidity with which he publishes the results in open-access journals, including 3-dimensional images of the fossils, so that others can download and create their own casts of them. They prefer the slow pace of other researchers who have typically taken decades to analyze and publish a single skeleton. But Berger's approach represents a new way to crowdsource the study of the remains by experts from around the world rather than a single person, and may be a harbinger of things to come in this internet age. PPPP. Discovering Our Earliest Ancestors 99. Berger's discoveries are within the subfield of prehistoric archaeology, otherwise known as paleoanthropology. Archaeologists in this field study a period that covers millions of years, from our earliest hominin ancestors right up until the beginnings of recorded history. Archaeological convention has split this long period of time into several eras. The Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, which extends from about 3.5 million years ago all the way down to anywhere from 20,000 to 12,000 years ago. The endpoint depends upon whether one is talking about Africa, Europe, or Asia. The Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age, which continues to about 10,000 years ago. The Neolithic, or New Stone Age, which lasts until about 4,500 years ago. The most famous modern family to work in prehistoric archaeology are the Leakeys. Louis and Mary Leakey are the first generation, their son Richard and his wife Maeve are the second generation, and Louise, granddaughter of Louis and Mary, is the third generation. Louise, who received her PhD from University College London in 2001, reportedly holds the record of being the youngest person ever to find a hominoid fossil. She was only 6 in 1977 when she found a tooth of a primate ancestor that was 17 million years old. 22 years later, in 1999, she and her mother Maeve found a 3.5 million-year-old skull belonging to an early human. Louise also has been involved since 1993 in the Kubi-Fora project in northern Kenya, where her father Richard first began working in 1968 and her mother Maeve started in 1969. Maeve began her career by working for Louis Leakey, who was first her dissertation advisor and later her father-in-law, after she married Richard in 1970. Richard became well known in his own right, with a long and distinguished career and numerous publications, including the book Origins, which was written for the general public. Among the notable discoveries made by his teams was a nearly complete 1.5 million-year-old skeleton. Kamoya Kimu, a native Kenyan working with Richard and who had worked with Louis and Mary from the 1950s, found the first fragment in 1984. The rest were painstakingly recovered during 5 seasons of meticulous excavation. Turkana Boy. 100 Chapter 6. As he is known, was probably about 8 to 11 years old when he died. He is usually considered to be an example of Homo erectus, that is, a direct ancestor of modern humans. PPPP. Louis grew up in Kenya and was one of the first people to argue that human origins should be sought in Africa rather than in Asia, which had been the generally accepted theory until then. He turned out to be correct, though it took a while for others to come around to his point of view. His case was proven by the finds that he and Mary made, beginning in 1948, but then especially from 1959 on. At that time, they were working in a canyon or ravine that was 30 miles long and 300 feet deep, known as Oldaway Gorge in Tanzania. Here Louis and Mary found skeletal fragments that they identified as coming from a new species of hominin. Actually, it was Mary who found the first fragment, because Louis was back at the camp with a fever. She went out with their 2 Dalmatian dogs to check on a site that they hadn't visited since 1931 and promptly found a fragment of skull and 2 teeth in a hominin jaw. She jumped in the Land Rover and drove back to get Louis. The 2 of them then found even more bone fragments and were able to reconstruct much of the skull. Because they were the first discoverers of this species, they got to name it. They initially called it Zinjanthropus boisei, after their primary sponsor at the time, Charles Boise, but it was later reassigned to a different genus and is now called Australopithecus boisei. They also initially thought that it dated to about 600,000 years ago, but a dating technique that was new at the time, involving measuring the radioactive decay of potassium into argon in volcanic rock, quickly showed that it was more like 1.75 million years old. At the time, the discovery created a sensation because of its extreme age. They promptly followed up their discovery the next year by discovering yet another new hominin species, Homo habilis. This time, they didn't name it after a sponsor. Instead, its name reflects the fact that fossil remains of this species are often found associated with stone tools, for Homo habilis translates roughly as handyman. Discovering our earliest ancestors 101. It would be hard for us to imagine what it was like for the Leakeys in those early days, except that we have photographs of them working from that period. We see them picking carefully at the dirt, in extremely hot conditions, with a huge umbrella planted for shade and several Dalmatian dogs keeping them company. It was after Lewis died in 1972 that Mary made what is considered to be her most significant discovery, the hominin footprints at Litoli, which were found in 1978 and 1979. The site is located about 45 kilometers southeast of Oldaway Gorge. Team members who were throwing elephant dung at each other for fun had found the first footprints at the site a few years earlier, in 1976, but animals had made all of those. 3 individuals who were walking across freshly fallen ash from a nearby volcano about 3.6 million years ago created the famous footprints. It is usually suggested that the footprints were made by hominins that we call Australopithecus afarensis. 2 of the trails appear to have been made by individuals walking in cadence, that is, walking together, but the third may be unrelated to the first 2. In any event, judging from the impressions that were left, all 3 were less than 5 feet tall. We can only imagine what it would have been like for those individuals at the time that they were walking through the area. The volcano would have been erupting in the distance, while ash was falling all around them, perhaps mixed with rain. It is likely to have been overcast, with smoke from the eruption obscuring the sun, but it is conceivable that it was dark as night, as Pliny the Younger reported during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius millions of years later. Animals would have been heading for safety, perhaps oblivious to the short hominins, but it doesn't look like our 3 were in too much of a hurry. The imprints of their feet indicate that they were walking rather than running, even though it is unlikely that the day was typical for them. In all, Mary Leakey and her team found about 70 footprints from these human ancestors that go on for almost 90 feet. They are the earliest direct evidence of hominin bipedalism and are now reproduced in the floor of the Hall of Human Origins in the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., as well as at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. 102 Chapter 6. These are not the only early footprints that have been found. Another series of footprints were found in 2007 and 2008 at Kubifora near Lake Turkana. These are only about 1.5 million years old, so they are more recent by 2 million years than the ones that Mary Leakey found. Members of Homo erectus similar to Turkana boy probably made the Kubifora footprints. They are about a size 9 in terms of today's men's shoes. PPPP. All these discoveries have helped to dispel the long shadow that was cast for decades by the so-called Piltdown Man, one of the most famous hoaxes in the history of archaeology. In 1912, long before the Leakeys had begun their explorations, a man named Charles Dawson announced that he had discovered some skull fragments, teeth, and a jawbone in the Piltdown gravel quarry in England. Quickly touted as the missing link between humans and apes, the discovery caused a sensation, but it also raised suspicions almost immediately. Partly, the controversy was nationalist. French scholar Boucher de Perthes had found early hominin tools in 1846 near the Somme River, and the Germans had discovered the species Neanderthal in their Neander Valley in 1856. The British had no counterpart until the discovery at Piltdown. Leading scientists published their doubts within just a few years, but it took until 1953 to prove definitively that Piltdown Man was a fabrication. The skull was human but dated to the medieval period, the fossilized teeth were from a chimpanzee, and the jawbone, which was about 500 years old, was from an orangutan. Dawson died in 1916, but he has long been suspected of creating the forgery. He is not the only suspect in this unsolved crime, though. The list of possible forgers is pretty long and even includes Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. PPPP. Real discoveries continued to be made. It was in 1974, soon after Louis Leakey died and just 2 years before Mary Leakey found the first footprints at Litoli, that Berkeley paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson. Discovering our earliest ancestors 103. Made a discovery that ensured his inclusion in the Prehistory Hall of Fame. As frequently happens in archaeology, it was a chance discovery. Johanson and a colleague were surveying near the site of Hadar, in Ethiopia, far to the north of Tanzania where the Leakeys had been working. After a long day in the hot sun with nothing to show for their efforts, they began walking back to where they had parked their Land Rover. Rather than go back the way that they had come, Johansson suggested going a different route, via a gully that they hadn't been through before. As he tells the story, first they spotted a bone from a hominin forearm, then, in rapid succession, a skull fragment, a leg bone, ribs, a pelvis, and a lower jaw. Within 2 weeks, they had found several hundred pieces of bone, all belonging to a single skeleton. Lucy, as she is called, died when she was about 20 years old, which was about 3.2 million years ago. She has been identified as an Australopithecus afarensis and resembled the individuals who left their footprints at Laetoli 500,000 years earlier. It is believed that she would have stood about 3.5 to 4 feet tall and weighed about 65 pounds at most. That's just an estimate, though, since we have only about 40% of her skeleton, but it was still the most complete hominin skeleton found to that time. The Beatles' song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was playing over and over again at the party that night back in the camp when they first returned with the skeletal remains. Sometime that evening they began referring to her as Lucy. She is still called that today. PPPP. Lee Berger's discoveries show that caves also can be extremely important sites for prehistoric archaeology, for they play a crucial role in helping us understand our connections to the deep past. Some of the most famous discoveries in caves were made in the 1920s and 1930s by an archaeologist named Dorothy Garrett and several colleagues within a cluster of caves on the slopes of Mount Carmel, south of the modern city of Haifa in what is now Israel. UNESCO recognized the caves as a World Heritage Site in 2012. Most of them are open to the public and can be seen without an appointment, the path for tourists is well. 104 Chapter 6. Maintained, but visitors must be prepared for very hot and dry conditions, especially during the summer. Garrett is widely recognized as one of the most important early archaeologists. She was the first woman to be named a professor at Cambridge University in England, where she held the Disney Chair of Archaeology from 1939 to 1952. This is a very distinguished professorship that has nothing to do with Walt Disney, but rather was established back in 1851 by a man named John Disney. Dorothy Garrett's specialty was the Paleolithic period. Her first excavation at Mount Carmel was in Cabra Cave, where she briefly dug in 1928. She then moved on and spent 5 years, from 1929 to 1934, excavating 2 other caves, of which the more famous is known as the Tabun Cave, the other is known as El Wad. She was able to show that the 2 caves were occupied pretty much continuously for about 500,000 years. Tabun Cave was occupied first, from about 500,000 years ago to 40,000 years ago. The occupation of El Wad begins just before Tabun is abandoned, about 45,000 years ago. Within Tabun Cave is a burial of a Neanderthal woman, dating to about 120,000 years ago. The skull indicates that her brain was about the same size as ours today, but she had no real chin and a very low forehead. There are also burials in nearby Skull Cave, which was excavated by Theodore McCown, a U.S. colleague of Garrett's. These burials, however, about 14 in all, and dating to between 120,000 and 80,000 years ago, are members of our own human species, Homo sapiens sapiens, also called anatomically modern people. The burials have generated much discussion among scholars, who include this evidence as support for the proposition that Neanderthals and modern humans were separate species and lived side by side for a time. Recent DNA studies indicate that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred and their European and Asian descendants, including many of us, have genetic markers of each. From 1982 to 1989, Harvard archaeologist Ofer Bar Yosef returned to Cabra Cave, where Garrett had dug in 1928. There he and his team found a Neanderthal burial, an adult male who lived about 60,000 years ago. Nicknamed Moshe, his may be the most complete. Discovering our earliest ancestors 105. Neanderthal skeleton found to date. It caused a great deal of excitement when he was discovered, because even though his head was missing, there were bones from his throat that indicated he may have been capable of speech, which had always been a question about Neanderthals and other pre-modern hominins. Speech being an important event in human evolution. Moshe would date to about the same time as the Neanderthal burials that have been found at Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, which Columbia anthropologist Ralph Seletsky excavated during several seasons from 1951 to 1961. The 10 individuals that Seletsky and his team excavated are usually dated to between 65,000 and 35,000 years ago. They have been of intense interest, in part because one of them, called Shanidar I, was a relatively old man. At the time of his death and showed evidence of having sustained, and survived, multiple injuries during his lifetime. Which means that his group took care of their sick and wounded. Another, an adult male known as Shanidar IV, who died sometime between the ages of 30 and 45, was long thought to have been buried with flowers, which was interpreted as some sort of burial ritual. Perhaps even an indication of belief in an afterlife or simply just a touching remembrance from a surviving family member. It has also been hypothesized that he might have been some sort of medicine man, since some of the flowers are from plants with medicinal properties, like ragwort and hollyhock. More recently, however, it has been suggested that the flower remains may be the result of later intrusions by a rodent, which is much less interesting and will mean rethinking much of what has been previously written. PPPP. In Europe, specifically in France and Spain, are other caves that are famous for their wall paintings, including Chauvet and Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain. Chauvet is by far the oldest, with the first remains there dating to about 35,000 BC, then comes Lascaux at approximately 15,000 BCE, and then Altamira at about 12,000 BCE. Altamira may be the youngest, relatively speaking, but it was the first of these three caves to be discovered. It was first noticed by a hunter. 106 Chapter 6. In 1868 and then visited by a local landowner, Don Marcelino Sanz de Sacciuola, in 1876. 2 years later, having been inspired by a show about Paleolithic art in Paris in 1878, de Sacciuola returned to the cave with his 8-year-old daughter Maria. She spotted the paintings on the wall while he was busy excavating the cave floor, looking for tools and other artifacts. His subsequent announcement of the discovery in 1880 was met with disbelief from the scholarly establishment. How could people this primitive create art that was so evocative, skilled, even artistic? It was only decades later, long after his death, that the scholars admitted he had been right about the antiquity of the paintings. The paintings in the cave are usually dated to about 12,000 BCE, at the time of the end of the last ice age, although some scholars have argued that they could be a good deal older. They certainly are not any more recent, because a rockslide sealed closed the entrance to the cave at that time. The cave itself is about 300 meters long, with the usual passages and chambers that we have to come to expect in such caves. Of the animals that are painted or engraved on the walls, the most famous are those on the polychrome ceiling, which include a herd of bison and a couple of horses, a deer, and possibly other animals. By 1979, 150,000 annual tourists were visiting Altamira. It was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1985. The huge number of visitors had taken its toll on the paintings, however, because of the humidity from so many people breathing in a small space, as well as graffiti and other vandalism, all of which caused damage. Soon thereafter, the quota of visitors was limited to fewer than 10,000 per year. Eventually, the cave was simply closed in 2002 and an exact replica of the cave was built nearby, which most tourists now visit. Since 2015, only 5 randomly selected visitors are allowed into the original cave for 37 minutes once a week. As for Lascaux, the story of its discovery is easily told. 4 teenage boys and their dog, whose name was Robot for some reason, came upon the cave in 1940. They were walking on a hill above the town of Montignac in the region of Dordogne, near Bordeaux in southern France, and decided to explore a hole that they found, reportedly because their dog started digging in it and they thought it might contain buried treasure. We now know that it did contain buried treasure, but it was discovering our earliest ancestors 107. A treasure trove of art, not the treasure of gold that the boys were hoping for. The cave is about 650 feet long, with at least 600 paintings and another 1,500 engravings on the walls. It was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979. It is interesting to note that, when Willard Libby was first experimenting with the technique of radiocarbon dating in 1947, which we will discuss in a future chapter, one of the first trials was done on a piece of charcoal that had been found at Lascaux. In part as a result of this technique, the cave is now generally dated to about 17,000 years ago, or 15,000 BCE. The current entrance, and possibly the original entrance as well, leads into the huge Hall of the Bulls, which has 4 huge bulls painted on the cave wall, covering a total of more than 5 meters. To be precise, these are aurochs, an extinct species of wild cattle. There also are smaller horses and tiny deer painted in the hall. I'm not sure that it is possible for us to fully appreciate what it would have been like to enter this cave 17,000 years ago. No electricity, no tourist path, nothing to prevent you from stumbling into the darkness. We have to imagine grasping some sort of flaming torch and walking gingerly into the dark gaping mouth of the cave. The flickering light reveals new animals on the walls every few feet, but just beyond is inky blackness, terrifying and still. Even if you're one of the artists who is responsible for some of the cave paintings, surely you had at least a small sense of dread each time you entered, placing one foot in front of another. Jumping at the shadows of the frightening animals painted on the walls, even the ones that you painted a few years before, but especially those that had been done by the unnamed ones who came before you in the distant past. From the Hall of Bulls, the path leads straight ahead into the axial gallery. This area has paintings of cattle, deer, and horses, including the so-called Chinese horses, which are not Chinese but are called that nevertheless, reportedly because of a vague resemblance to paintings of horses from the Sung dynasty in China. If you turn to the right instead of going into the axial gallery, however, there is a passageway that has almost 400 more engravings, mostly of horses. If you go right again from that point, the Great 108 Chapter 6 Apse appears, which has more than 1,000 additional engravings on the walls. Lascaux also features the Chamber of the Felines, which has 6 large felines among dozens of other engravings. The cave was never really excavated but was simply prepared for tourism and opened to the public in 1948. Having more than 100,000 annual visitors caused the same problems as at Altamira, only they were felt at Lascaux first. By 1963, the cave was closed to the public and only small groups were let in from then on. Problems still abound, though. In 2000, after the installation of a new air conditioning system, fungus began to grow on the walls and the images. In 2006, black mold began to grow as well. The damage is probably irreparable, which is why a replica of the cave has been built nearby, so that the public can visit it instead. Chauvet is the oldest of the 3 caves that we are discussing, but it also is the most recently discovered. It is located in the Ardèche region of southern France. The huge cave may be as much as 400 meters long and covers more than 8,000 square meters. It was recently declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2014, just 20 years after it was first discovered and explored in late December 1994 by Jean-Marie Chauvet and a small group of colleagues. Chauvet also has been brought to life by a 3-dimensional Chauvet cave painting. Discovering Our Earliest Ancestors 109. Movie produced by the famous director Werner Herzog that was released in 2011. Nearly 4,000 artifacts and animal bones have been found in the cave, as well as 1,000 images on the walls. The drawings and paintings in it are simply exquisite. They include some of the earliest and best-preserved cave art in the world, depicting at least 13 different species, ranging from lions, horses, and woolly rhinos to owls, mammoths, bears, and other animals. They also may include the oldest known images of an erupting volcano. Discussions about their date have been heated. Until recently, the generally accepted dates from radiocarbon analysis, conducted on 30 to 80 samples over the years, put most of them at about 30,000 BCE, when the cave was thought to have been first occupied. The cave was then abandoned for several thousand years, before being reoccupied in about 25,000 BCE, at which time dozens more paintings were added. There is also a child's footprint that has been preserved on the soft clay floor of the cave, which probably dates from the second period of occupation. These dates have recently been challenged. The newest study presents 259 radiocarbon dates, taken from the pigments used in the black paintings as well as bones and charcoal found in the cave, as well as nearly 100 more dates derived using more esoteric techniques involving uranium-thorium, thermoluminescence, and chlorine-36. These methods suggest that cave bears actually first began using the cave almost 50,000 years ago, and the earliest paintings were created about 35,000 BCE. This phase ended in about 31,500 BCE, when both the bears and the people stopped using the cave. It was then abandoned for about 2,500 years before being reoccupied by a new group of people, but not bears, from 29,000 BCE to 26,000 BCE. After that, a rockslide closed off the cave entrance so that neither people nor animals could enter from then on, until the cave was rediscovered in 1994. The discovery of Chauvet Cave was not accidental, though. According to a detailed New Yorker article published in 2008, Jean-Marie Chauvet was a park ranger working for France's Ministry of Culture and was actively searching for such caves. This particular cave is located high up on a limestone cliff above the former route of the Ardèche River. It is very close to a natural limestone bridge called the Pont d'Arc. Although 110 Chapter 6. The original entrance to the cave had been closed for at least 20,000 years because of the rockslide. Members of Chauvet's group noticed cold air coming from a small opening on the cliff face. The smallest member of the group, a woman named Eliette Brunel, climbed in after they had removed a few rocks to enlarge the opening. The others quickly followed her and used a chain ladder that they had brought to descend a deep 30-foot shaft. They found themselves in a huge cavern, with stalagmites and stalactites everywhere. They noticed animal bones on the floor and then the first few paintings on the walls. Brunel yelled out, "They have been here," meaning Paleolithic cave painters. In a Smithsonian article published in April 2015, Joshua Hammer reconstructed what happened next, using details from a 1996 memoir published by the explorers. The trio moved gingerly across the earthen floor, trying not to tread on the crystallized ashes from an ancient fire pit, gazing in wonder at hundreds of images. We found ourselves in front of a rock wall covered entirely with red ochre drawings. The panel contained a mammoth with a long trunk, then a lion with red dots spattered around its snout in an arc, like drops of blood. We crouched on our heels, gazing at the cave wall, mute with stupefaction. There is some debate and dispute about exactly who was with Chauvet that day and whom he brought there soon afterward, as well as whether he was even the first to notice the small initial opening. Regardless, inside the cave they saw hundreds of drawings and paintings, some huge and some fairly small, some isolated and others painted as a group, overlapping as needed. They quickly alerted the authorities, who sent Jean Klotz, a specialist in cave paintings and a scientific advisor to the Ministry of Culture. Klotz declared it to be one of the great discoveries of the 20th century. Klotz assembled a team of specialists who have been studying the Chauvet cave paintings ever since 1996. In all that time, the cave has remained closed to the public, in order to avoid the kinds of problems caused by opening the Lascaux and Altamira caves to tourists. In fact, even the research team enters the Chauvet cave only twice a year, for a Discovering Our Earliest Ancestors 111. Few weeks in the spring and another few weeks in the fall. At all other times, a 4-foot-tall locked steel door prevents anyone from entering. This is the only one of these three caves that has been excavated using modern methods. The cave has a number of parts. The original entrance chamber, which is now sealed off from the outside by the ancient rockslide, leads into a huge area, named the Brunel Chamber, for Eliette Brunel, the first person to enter the cave in thousands of years. From here you can enter the Chamber of the Bear Hollows, which has a lot of evidence of occupation by cave bears, including hollows that they dug into the soft clay floor. 2 galleries can be reached from the Bear's Chamber. One is a fairly short gallery called the Cactus Gallery. This one contains the first painting seen by Chauvet and his group, a small red mammoth painted on a rock, which was the painting that Eliette Brunel was looking at when she called out to the others. The other gallery is much larger and leads to more chambers. This gallery is known as the Red Panels Gallery, since most of the paintings found here are in a series of panels on the eastern wall and are primarily painted in red. From the Red Panels Gallery, one can go to the left and enter the Candle Gallery, which is the beginning of the second part of the cave system. After the Candle Gallery is the Hilaire Chamber, named for Christian Hilaire, the third member of the original trio who discovered the cave. This chamber is about 30 meters in diameter, so about 100 feet wide, with a ceiling that is nearly as high. There are numerous wall paintings and drawings in it. Some of them overlap, probably meaning that they were created at different points in time. A natural calcite coating also covers a number of them, meaning that they cannot possibly be fakes, in case anyone was wondering. From the Hilaire chamber there are two choices. If you continue heading west, you'll come to the skull chamber, where a bear skull was found very carefully placed on a stone that had fallen from the ceiling. Beyond the skull chamber is the final gallery in this direction, the gallery of the crosshatching, where a large horse is drawn on the rock. If you continue north from the Hilaire chamber instead of west, though, you enter the Megaloceros gallery. There are drawings of 112 Chapter 6. Several rhinoceroses in here, but the gallery gets its name from a drawing of a megaloceros, which is an extinct type of giant deer with huge antlers. The largest member of the Megaloceros genus stood far taller than an average human and is known variously as an Irish elk, Irish deer, or giant elk. French researchers proposed in early 2000s